Let's say you've got £1,000 to spend on your first serious mountain bike. Should you go for a hardtail or a full sus? Now, a lot of people will tell you that a hardtail is much better for developing skills because it forces you to use good technique and good line choice. We're not so sure about that. I think that a full sus kind of teaches you different skills rather than less skills. But we're going to put that debate to one side for today and just focus on what is the best bang for your buck and how do these two bikes compare on the trail. I always used to think that if you've got less than £1,000 to spend, it's not a good idea to try and stretch to a full suspension bike because the extra complexity of a full suspension system means that the componentry and the geometry and the quality suffers so much that you're better off just going with a hardtail. These days, it's really amazing what you can get for £1,000 because there's so much more competition at this price point, and because of the trickle down of technologies from higher end bikes, you can get much more for your money at this price point. So we thought it was worth revisiting this question and seeing if you can get a full suspension bike for £1,000, which is better than a hardtail at the same price. The two bikes we have today are the Carrera Titan X full suspension bike, which has 130mm of travel front and rear and 650B wheels. We also have the Voodoo Bizango Carbon, which has 120mm suspension fork, 29-inch wheels, and as the name suggests, a carbon frame. And remember, both these bikes retail for £1,000. So both of ththese bikes have a 1x12 drivetrain, so you've got all of the gearing options you could ever wish for with the security and simplicity of a 1x drivetrain. Both of them have reasonably powerful Shimano brakes, which I think offer better consistency and lever feel than Shimano's more expensive offerings. They both have RockShox air-sprung forks, which not only allow you to adjust the spring rate with the air pressure to suit your weight, but also have adjustable rebound and compression damping, as well as a 15mm through axle to secure the front wheel, which should in theory give you more precise steering than a quick release fork. Like any modern bike should, they've both got really short stems and reasonably wide bars to improve the handling, as well as wide rims, which should improve the stability of the tyre when cornering hard. Both these bikes have pretty high quality tyres too. Both of the bikes we're going to be reviewing are from Halfords, which is where a lot of people buy bikes at this price point in the UK. Now, while we sometimes do sponsor videos on BikeRadar, you'll always know about it. It'll be clearly written in the description. This is not an example of that. So there's no affiliation with Halfords or any other brand. This is 100% editorial, and I'm going to do a fully honest review of both these bikes. So despite the extra complexity of the full suspension frame, both of these bikes have pretty similar componentry on them. And in fact, the Carrera also has a dropper post, which makes undulating terrain a lot more seamless to ride, whereas the hardtail has a fixed seat post. But of course, the major differences are in the frames. Obviously, the big headline here is that the Bizango has a carbon frame, but it's not just about the bragging rights that come with that frame material. It's also a really sleek looking frame with very neat internal cable routing, including a port for a dropper seat post. It also has boost axle spacing front and rear, and that's not a deal breaker, but it does mean that if you wanted to upgrade to a fancier set of wheels, maybe borrow a set of wheels for race day, this bike can accept them. But the thing that really impresses me about the Bizango is the geometry. It's got 4 sizes in the range, from small to extra large, which is what we have here. The geometry is kind of halfway between a really modern cross-country race bike and more of a trail hardtail. That means you get 425mm chainstays and a 73-degree effective seat angle, and those numbers are pretty par for the course for a modern cross-country bike. But you get a little bit more reach than you would normally expect to work with that short, for a cross-country bike, 50mm stem. That means that you get slightly more precise steering and a bit more stability. You also get a 66.5-degree head angle, which is a few degrees slacker than most cross-country hardtails, and that means it's a bit more versatile and capable when you start riding more technical trails. Meanwhile, the Carrera is an all-aluminium frame, as you'd expect, and the frame in general is perhaps not as aesthetically pleasing as the Bizango, and in certain places the welds are a bit rough around the edges. It also has a non-boost front wheel and a quick release rear axle, And while these aren't major problems in themselves, it does mean that if you wanted to upgrade those wheels for whatever reason, your options would be a bit more limited. But perhaps the most critical difference between these two bikes, aside from the rear suspension, is the sizing. So the Carrera is only available in 3 sizes. We've got the largest size, which is called the Large, and Halfords say that this will fit anyone up to 190 centimeters tall. Now, I'm 190 centimeters tall, and this bike does not feel like it fits me well. So you may want to take Halfords sizing recommendations with a pinch of salt and consider sizing up as long as you can get the seat low enough in the frame. Another major difference that you may have guessed by now is the weight. So the Carrera weighs 15.8 kilograms in size large with no pedals, whereas the Bizango weighs 12.9 kilos, so there's nearly 3 kilograms difference. And those weights are with inner tubes, so if you make them tubeless and both have tubeless ready rims, you'll save a few hundred grams off that as well. So the weight of the Carrera is pretty similar to other full suspension mountain bikes at this price point, such as the Caliber Boss Nut, whereas the Bizango is impressively light even for a hardtail at this price. So that's how these bikes compare on paper, but how do they compare when it comes to riding? As you can probably guess, the Bizango is far more rapid when it comes to smooth climbs. Not only is it lighter, but you also have no rear suspension, so there's no pedal bob, which wastes energy as the suspension moves while you pedal. You can also lock the fork out pretty easily if you really want to sprint up a tarmac climb, in which case it's a really quick bike indeed. The larger 29-inch wheels might help a little bit to kind of smooth out the bumps and help carry speed a little bit better, but you also have very fast rolling tyres. You've got a Maxxis Ardent at the front and a Maxxis Ardent Race on the rear. They have very little rolling resistance, which means less drag and more speed. However, if the ground gets rougher, I'm just talking about the sort of slightly cobbly surface that is typical of a UK trail centre, then the 29er wheels do not make up for the lack of suspension in terms of smoothness. And this is where the Carrera has quite a considerable advantage. Because of the rear suspension, it is not only more comfortable over these surfaces, but it's also far less fatiguing to ride because you're not having to get in and out of the saddle all the time as the terrain changes. And also on very rough surfaces, even on a climb, I think it carries its speed better as well because the suspension is absorbing more of those vibrations and maintaining your forward momentum a little bit better. Added to that, when the terrain is undulating between uphills, downhills and sort of technical traverses, just having that dropper post is another advantage on top of that. Whereas the Bizango, not only is it a fixed seat post, but the seat clamp, it requires an Allen key. So if you want to drop the seat, you're going to have to stop, get a multi-tool out and spend a few seconds or even minutes doing that. Which in practice means you're going to do a lot of high posting, so riding technical descents with the seat up. Some people are better at doing this than others. I'm certainly not an expert at high posting, but however good you are, it's always easier to descend with the seat dropped. But when you do take the time to drop the saddle on the Bizango, it's a surprisingly capable descender. I mean, okay, the tyres are not the grippiest in soft conditions, but because it has that slack hand angle and a fairly short stem, and the fork performs really well, which I find kind of leads you down technical and steep sections with really good confidence. So it's only on the rougher trails where the Carrera Titan X has the advantage. Where it's smooth, but maybe steep and technical, I much preferred the shape of the Voodoo Bizango. It just gives you a bit more room to maneuver and therefore a bit more confidence to push the bike into those steeper sections. Having said that, if you're a shorter rider than I am, then the more limited sizing options of the Carrera Titan X are going to be less of an issue for you. And really when it comes to riding rough terrain, there's kind of no substitute for having a fully suspended bike. So to summarize, whether I was going uphill or downhill, I actually preferred the Voodoo so long as the trails were sufficiently smooth. Whereas if it was rougher, there's really no substitute for that full suspension, even if you're talking about climbing. The Carrera Titan X is much more of a generalist. It does most things pretty well, and it holds its own when the trails start to get a bit rougher. But if you compare it to other full suspension trail bikes, which cost a little bit more, the sizing and the geometry start to let it down, especially for taller riders. In contrast, the Voodoo Bizango is more of a specialist. it's certainly geared more to the cross-country end of the spectrum. But when you compare it to other cross-country hardtails, even ones that cost a fair bit more than this, I think there's much less of a difference. So to conclude, if you've got £1,000 to spend, whether you should buy a hardtail or a full sus, of course depends on what type of riding you want to do and specifically how rough the trails are that you typically ride. So which of these two bikes would you go for if you had £1,000 to spend? Or would you go for something completely different? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and maybe click the little bell icon so you get notified whenever we upload a video.